let's get started. Thank you everyone for joining us today for our 6th webinar. I just wanted to, before I introduce Julia Goyal, who is our panelist for today's webinar, I wanted to let you know that if you need a certificate of attendance, we can do that for you afterwards. The webinar will also be broadcast or put up on YouTube with subtitles within probably a couple of weeks or maybe a month, given the busyness of the season from now. Please hold all your questions and answers until after the presentation, and then we will get to your questions after that. So I will start by introducing Julia Goyal, who is our panelist for today. Julia is a first-year doctoral student at the University of Waterloo. As a student, she finds herself consistently engaged with the intersection of work, health, and technology, as well as inspired by the complexity of interdisciplinary work. She is pursuing an interdisciplinary PhD between University of Waterloo's School of Public Health and Health Systems and the Faculty of Engineering. She was a CRWDP student fellow throughout her master's degree in public health at the University of Waterloo and currently holds an S. Leonard Design training fellowship with work and health. With new forms of work emerging in the sharing economy, there is an added pressure upon Canada's work and health systems to function well and support workers. Technology is turning the traditional job on its head. Sharing economy platforms introduces both a new form of worker, the micro-entrepreneur, and a human-computer interface in lieu of the traditional employer-employee relationship. This alternative mode of employment provides flexible work arrangements, but all the while is insecure and isolating. Julia's research interest lies within public health and the changing nature of work, and to this end, she focused her master's research on the health and safety in the growing and lucrative and unregulated sphere of Airbnb rentals. This research explored Airbnb hosts' perceptions and management of health and safety risks at work, as well as the supports made available to them. In her webinar, Julia will discuss findings from her master's thesis, Home, Work, and Health in the Airbnb. So Julia, I will let you take it away.
So thank you so much, Pamela. So I'm so excited to be here today as the panelist and to have the opportunity to share my findings from my research. Before I begin, I just would like to acknowledge both CRWDP and the School of Public Health and Health Systems at the University of Waterloo for supporting this project, as well as the guidance I've received from my supervisor, Ellen McEachen, as well as my committee members, Dr. Elena Niederman and Dr. Phil Bigelow, throughout the course of my master's. Just a note about terminology, oftentimes the sharing economy is addressed as the sharing economy or the collaborative consumption economy, but since these terms are kind of misleading, we're now moving towards new terminology. So for this thesis, I refer to it as the access economy. But it's pretty much on-demand shared access to goods and services that we're seeing becoming more popular. And so what is the access economy? The access economy is any platform that uses some sort of mobile app to connect dispersed networks of individuals and provides them with this on-demand shared access to goods and services. So it is a system based on trust, and it's a system based on reviews that allows the sharing to occur. And so in 2017, Stats Canada reported that 2.7 million Canadians participated in the access economy between November 2015 and October 2016 and spent nearly $1.31 billion. And so this access economy has been very disruptive, and it has unsettled various sectors, as we've seen. And since it's only growing, some analysts suggest that it will have a very big impact on work and will consequently reinvent work as we know it. And so one very prominent example of the access economy is Airbnb, and that is the focus of my research. And so we'll begin with that. So in terms of Airbnb, as I'm sure most of you know, just a really brief overview, you have the host and you have the guest. And Airbnb is sort of like the interperson between the host and guest. And now Airbnb is what's giving both host and guest to this market, access to this market. And so the host puts their profile and listing on Airbnb that the guest can see, and then the guest can make that request to the host to book that Airbnb. And it is through Airbnb's platform that the host is able to provide its services to the guest. And so there is this fee exchange, and money does exchange hands between Airbnb and the host and Airbnb and the guest. But this is all very much done through these web-based processes that Airbnb is so much focused in on. In terms of health and safety, because that is the focus of this research, Airbnb has adopted a rather laissez-faire attitude in regards to ensuring health and safety of users. And so even though it does encourage hosts to install, smoke and carbon detectors or what have you, hosts are very much working in silos, right? And Airbnb doesn't really confirm that these devices or these gadgets are ever in place and no inspections are ever done. And they pretty much just refer hosts to local laws in terms of installation and in terms of process, in terms of health and safety. And so in terms of safety for appliances, for equipment, for hazards in the workplace, in the space, Airbnb isn't really doing much of that, and much of that is left to the host to do. And so health and safety requirements, any standards, they may not actually be upheld by Airbnb hosts. The closest comparator to Airbnb are hotels, as they both offer these short-term accommodation. And so with hotels, we're seeing that the everyday workings of these hotel workers are very much they're very much monitored in the sense that the operator of the hotel has to abide by all these various policies and regulations in place. So whether that be food safety, fire code, building code, licensing, insurance, employment standards. However, for the Airbnb, we're not seeing the same thing. And so Airbnb hosts are given a lot more leeway in terms of how they operate their business. And since Airbnb is this very largely self-regulating and informal system, there are various implications to health and safety. And so hosts are considered self-employed. And because they're self-employed workers, they're not protected. In the interior context, they're not protected under the Employment Standards Act. And so hosts don't really have the right to certain things such as health coverage, insurance against injuries, paid vacations, job security, stable income, things of that sort. And despite the importance of this, there's very little lit on the health and safety situations of hosts and of guests. But a lot has been done in terms of the occupational health and safety of hotel workers, in terms of the physical, chemical, biological, and psychosocial risks. And so since the work environments of the host and the hotel worker are not quite identical, both individuals do belong to the same sort of industry. And so it's really important for us to keep in mind that these experiences of hotel workers do extend to potential health and safety risks for hosts. For guests, because it's very hard to talk about hosts without talking about the guests because they're so intermingled and so connected. Since this marketplace is based on trust, and since there is a lack of formal structure in terms of health and safety, the health and safety of these guests very much lie in the hands of the host. And so if the hosts are adhering by the regulations and guidelines and such that we see in hotels, then they may provide their guests with a very clean and safe space, which is great. But there are hosts that could not do this, and if that happens, then these hosts wouldn't really be giving these guests a very healthy and safe experience. Online reviews, in theory, they could inform the guests' decision-making in the system in selecting the accommodations, in selecting the hosts that appear better or appear more positive with more positive reviews. However, like some research has shown, there is this positivity bias that does exist in reviews. And so the true value of these reviews are quite questionable. In the media, we've seen, we see this all the time, guests experiencing very negative things, so whether it be sexual assault, privacy violation, violence, racism. And so there definitely is a need for better measures and better monitoring of the health and safety of guests. And so currently as well, we're seeing a lot of discussion in terms of tighter regulation on Airbnb because of the effects on housing availability and affordability. But I thought that health and safety should also be added to discussion. At the time that I had to pick my research topic for my master's, it was around the same time that Dr. Ellen McGuckin had just started up her study on health and safety of Uber. So the two of us had thought that, you know what, it might be pretty neat to study Airbnb and Uber side by side and see sort of these cross parallels that are occurring between these two very prominent platform economies. And so what did I do? So I decided to explore the health and safety of Airbnb, particularly to document the experiences, both positive and negative, of hosts and guests as they relate to their health and safety, and to possibly even identify changes that could improve the system altogether. So I took an interpretive approach to understand these experiences and the understandings of the system, as well as to shed light on the situation. Risk perception and risk management are both two things that have a very important social dimension to them. And so I thought that the exploratory nature of this research really did call for an interpretive approach to really hone into this individual social experience, because obviously there's so many users in the system and all these users have different experiences and they make different meaning of these experiences. So I did use a multi-method design. So I first did a document analysis of Airbnb Community Forum, which is a forum that Airbnb hosts themselves, on which hosts can talk about their experiences and give each other advice on things. And after I did this analysis, which informed my interview guide for interviews and just gave me a better picture of how things were laid out in the system, I did interviews, 8 with hosts, 9 with guests, to really explore, as I said, sort of user risk perception and user risk management. And so these interviews did occur over the phone or they were face-to-face. They're about an hour in length. Like most qualitative interview studies, they were audio recorded, they were transcribed. And so my final sample was, as I said, 8 hosts, 9 guests. A 40-60 split in terms of male and females for hosts and a 50-50 split for guests, just to reflect the actual gender composition that we see with Airbnb users. And in terms of experience, hosts would have had to host it for at least 1 year to be included, while guests would have had to have used these services for at least, guests would have had to have used these services at least 3 times. So in order to really understand what was happening, I decided to separate my findings into 3 sections: before the stay, during the stay, after the stay, just to really understand the logical progression of these experiences that were shared with me. And for each phase, there was a separate a different focus of analysis. So for before the stay, the focus was very much on risk assessment. For during the stay, the focus was very much on risk management. And for after the stay, the focus was on systematic pressures. So we'll just go through some findings that I came across. So first, in terms of risk assessment of users, on Airbnb's online interface, guests can look and search for all the things that they're looking for in terms of listing features. And so users can look through the listings for, you know, a description of the Airbnb, a list of amenities, occupancy limits, photos, cancellation policies, house rules, things of that sort. And they really get a sense of the space. They get a sense if the space fits their needs. They get a sense of the host based on the information that they provide, and just on how the house rules are written and presented, they can get a sense for who their host is. So for example, Kristen, I guess, that I spoke with, and of course that is a pseudonym, she had told me, I guess like you can kind of get a vibe, even like in their description and stuff for like what they're saying. Like if it sounds like sketchy, then I wouldn't probably want to go for that. If they sound really nice in their description, I'd be more likely to go with them. So we're seeing that guests are really trying to predict what their experience would be like with the host. And this is very important for them. And also they really find reviews very important in that way, because they get a chance to get feedback from past guests as to how the experience was. And so they're really trying to figure out whether or not that space and that host in particular is suitable for their needs. And so the online identity and branding on Airbnb's interface has very much informed users' risk assessment and their process of risk assessment, because they're able to receive all this information through the system. The vetting process is also quite key. So as I mentioned earlier, there is a lack of policy and there's a lack of structure within Airbnb. And so users are very much left to their own devices, and they're very much left to just judge on their own each other's characters and personalities, to weed out the bad from the good, to look out for any clues or red flags, to just as these very much informal tools to assess risk. And so just like earlier, they're still trying to feel their way through the system. And so guests, if they're on the system, they're looking for hosts that have a lot of experience with hosting, and they have many and very positive reviews online. And if they see this, then they feel comfortable booking with that host. Hosts, they rely on reviews primarily, and on the interaction that they have with the guests. And if guests provide ambiguous or vague responses to any questions, then hosts don't really feel comfortable providing accommodation to those guests. Some hosts do discriminate based on race, age, and gender, as Tariq, he said to me actually. Like if it's a young crowd and if it's all women, I think my parents would prefer all young women versus all young men. And by young, I mean like college age or like even younger, like their age, their gender. My dad even looks to see ethnicity if they have too many people. So it's not very good, of course, but that is the nature of how things are happening right now in the system, with no system really in place. Finally, the booking process. So if the host and guests are satisfied, then the booking is made between the host and guests. However, the stress of the unknown in this process, of course, can be rather disorienting. And so guests, they like this booking process because for them, they're able to book things quite quickly if the hosts are using a sponsor. But hosts, they spoke about instant booking as a concern for them. So instant booking, as the name suggests, allows guests to book an Airbnb instantly without needing any approval by the host. But from the host perspective, this feature, it eliminates the vetting process altogether, and it basically overrides any house rules that they have. And so obviously this is very concerning because hosts then are still compelled to use it because Airbnb provides so much incentive if they do. So now they're allowing guests that perhaps otherwise they wouldn't have allowed in their space. So in terms of health and safety risks now, so cleanliness and spread of disease is the greatest concern for guests, and rightfully so. Nassim shares his experience. I think obviously cleanliness is a huge part because when you think about it, hosts are making a living out of this. So that implies that that place is probably rented out 99% of the time. That means that there's so many different people from so many different places, there's so many different activities that could take place in that place, and all those things can impose health hazards for the next person coming in and renting that place out. Physical harm is not actually a concern. Liam says, if I'm the host and I ever been purposely hurt, like they drop something on me, I break a toe, like whatever. But if like I got purposely hit by them, like someone was aggressive and like purposely tried to hurt me, I would probably stop hosting totally. So in my interviews that I had with hosts and guests, no one shared any experiences involving physical harm, and it didn't appear to be a concern for either hosts or guests. Safety risks. So guests and hosts, they identified various risks as it pertained to their safety. This included the safety level of the neighborhood of the Airbnb. Oftentimes guests will do that background check of them by themselves to make sure that the neighborhood and the area is safe. Keys were also considered very important. Having a key to their own room made guests feel very safe in the Airbnb, especially because they were able to lock up any valuables that they had. For hosts, their home obviously is a very intimate space. And so giving a key to their home to a complete stranger was very unsettling for them. In 1 or 2 cases online, a guest did overstay their welcome and wouldn't leave. And so in those cases, obviously, it's quite scary because the host still has access to your home. ID verification. So this is more of a concern for hosts than guests, actually. Airbnb has a really strange policy and process in terms of ID verification. Its current process requires users to provide 2 pieces of ID, and that could be government issued ID, or it could be pieces of online social identity. So what that means is that someone could provide like their Yelp account, Facebook account, LinkedIn. And so there's, users are really questioning whether or not this process is sufficient. In one experience, in Susan's situation, the guests actually had been convicted of child pornography offenses prior to booking. And obviously this wouldn't be the kind of person that you would want around your grandchildren, and her grandchildren were actually present on site. So she describes the experience. He was using a false name, and I found that after he arrived. He was using the Wi-Fi here at the house, and that put a violation on his parole. But I didn't know that until just before he was leaving because of something he had let slip. And not about that, but about his name, about what his real name was. And I was able to Google him. And so Susan, she believed that, Airbnb could have done a lot more to verify the guest's identity and just in a way to prevent the booking from happening in the first place. So the guest had to use an alias name, and that definitely did complicate the situation. But this experience definitely does shed light on the possibility for hosts and guests to create fake accounts online. Finally, also, undesirable guests were also a concern that hosts mentioned. So sometimes hosts didn't really feel comfortable hosting certain individuals. Perhaps the Airbnb wasn't a suitable space, and they wanted to protect themselves against liability, property damage, theft, all those sorts of things. But due to instant booking and due to all these systemic pressures that are on them, sometimes host participants, they told me that they still hosted these guests anyway. And so in addition to the lack of process that is instant booking also increases the chances of these hosts exposing themselves to these guests. And so they could be undesirable for whatever reason, pets, children, perhaps they have, perhaps they're ill or sick, perhaps they're like party animals. In any of these situations, the host may not feel well equipped, but they're still feeling this pressure. And that can obviously add stress for them as a host. Psychosocial stressors. So speaking about stress, the host does experience quite a bit of stress, and one for sure is financial pressure on them. Most hosts that I spoke to, they could not really consider closing up shop, so to speak, because so much of their livelihood depends on their earning from Airbnb. And so as these costs are piling up, hosts, they have the pressure on themselves to really try to make the most amount of money that they can in the least amount of time. And so they describe adding all these personal touches and going the extra mile and really bending over backwards for their guests just to stay competitive. Gender is also a big thing. Gender dynamics are very important to consider, and gender just adds a layer of complexity to the whole system and to the host and guest interaction. And so a person may experience unwelcome advances by either someone of the opposite sex or opposite gender, same gender. And there were experiences of both with the participants that I spoke to. For example, this example right here, one of my guests repeatedly asked me if I had a boyfriend. I do, and said so, and repeatedly made grabs for my lower back. After I dodged a few grabs, he succeeded in grabbing my ass when I bent over to plug something in. I swatted his hand off, yelled, "No, I really have a boyfriend," and jumped away from him. As I was showing him the patio, he tried to kiss me. Again, I swatted. Then I told him that I was going to go, and when I went inside to retrieve my purse before leaving, he blocked the door in an effort to keep me inside. I had to hit him to make him leave the door. So Olivia is obviously sharing an experience that no one would ever want as a guest. And there is sort of this unspoken rule between hosts and between guests who are female, that hosting is a lot safer with female-only guests, and as a female host, and also vice versa. So if you are a guest, they feel safer staying with female hosts. So all in all, sorry, one second. All in all, hosts, they're experiencing various systemic pressures. They really don't know what their options are, and the stress of the unknown adds to that. And so hosting is really not as free and as flexible as Airbnb lets on. Reviews are very subjective and they're very unreliable. A 5-star rating can mean two different things to two different people, and so hosts, they describe their frustration navigating that, because sometimes what the services that they're providing they think is 5 stars, but Airbnb will describe 3 stars as being good, and so a guest will say, okay, well 3 stars is good, so I'll say 3. On the other hand, the host is in trouble with Airbnb if they're not getting the 5 stars. Hosts are also finding it quite difficult to strike a balance between work and life, especially if Airbnb isn't the only kind of work that they do. And so it's really hard for them to really juggle all of life's commitments. And with that, it's also quite hard for them to juggle the rules of the system, because their policies are so vague and it's very unclear, and everyone is just going off of their own understanding of the rules. So whether that be cancellation policy, identity verification, instant booking, process of payment, everything is very blurry. And with all this taking place and happening, hosts are receiving very little support from Airbnb. And so just as some takeaways from this, so how can guests sort of stay healthy and stay safety in the system? And so to eliminate these health and safety risks, they may travel in groups. If they read online reviews beforehand and they interact with the host, that would help gauge whether or not it's a good fit for them. Ensure the neighborhood of the Airbnb is safe before booking and before talking to the host. And in many cases from experiences, it came about that, you know, if they opted for a private room or full dwelling Airbnb, and it allowed them to sort of avoid unnecessary interaction with hosts and with guests, it kept them healthy and safe. In terms of hosts, so they should be aware of a few things. First, whether or not they're on-site or off-site. So if they're cohabiting the Airbnb with the guest, this obviously does allow for more interaction between the host and guest. And when a host is off-site, it kind of appeared that health and safety risk sort of also appears to be off-mind, and also weren't as present because there was no interaction as such between host and guest. Second, with the more hosts they get, with the more guests they host, with the more guests they host and the more frequently that they're hosting these guests, it could create a very stressful environment for hosts when they're working. And so just to be mindful of not, you know, booking back-to-back bookings. And also if you have multiple listings as a host, so sometimes hosts may only have one listing that's, you know, like a room in their house. And in that case, it's quite easy to manage, or it's easier to manage. But in some cases, hosts described having multiple listings, and that did create greater exposure to them to the health and safety concerns that they had. One thing that we can do to mitigate these risks, of course, is to really have a well laid out cleaning and maintenance system. And so the more experienced hosts have, they described having these really nicely laid out systems that really help them manage their practices well and address things as they arose. And so there are various implications to these findings in terms of precarious employment, in terms of other platform work. But for time's sake, I'll just discuss one, and that's sort of like the blurry line between home and work. And so home as a workplace has become commonplace now and is becoming more and more common. And so increasingly we're seeing more attention to this blurry line between home and the workplace, and just trying to understand better how individuals are crossing the line between what is personal and what becomes professional. And so there's a growing body of research currently on this blurry line between home and workplace, and the challenges in maintaining this work-life balance with no physical barrier between home and work, while still reporting high job satisfaction. And so in the context of Airbnb, home and workplace is the same thing. They're one and the same. And we're seeing something very similar with hosts. And so hosts in the study, they were satisfied with their work, but it was very stressful for them. And so at what point does someone's home stop being home and it starts to become their workplace, and when does it switch back? It was very hard for hosts to navigate this. Tariq, one host that I've spoken to, he illustrated this really unclear boundary between home and work. He was probed about, his physical health concerns that he had as a host, and he actually shared with me that it was actually quite difficult for him to distinguish between between work-related and non-work-related injuries, because for him they were the same thing. And so perhaps this blurry line that exists between home and work spaces allows for hosts to fail to recognize these occupational health and safety risks that are present in the system. And perhaps it also allows them to not take these risks very seriously. So from interviews, it also sort of appeared that, hosts are basically just thinking that the risks that come with the job are just things that they have to just endure as hosts, and they don't really consider them very seriously for that reason. Home is also a very intimate space. And so besides all these security concerns and other safety concerns that hosts may have, opening one's home to a guest, I would imagine, would make the host also feel quite vulnerable, in the sense that they're sharing a very intimate space, and in turn a very personal part of their life with a complete stranger. And so based on interviews and based on analysis online of forums, it was made very clear to me that users really did not know how to behave and how to act in this setting. And they discussed the challenges engaging just how to behave when visiting someone's home, and how it differs between being a guest at someone's place and being a guest at an Airbnb. And should they treat the Airbnb as an intimate space? Should they treat it as a commercial rental? Should they treat it as somewhere in the middle? And hosts, they also found it quite difficult with gauging just how hospitable to be to guests, because they wanted to be hospitable, but they also didn't want to overstep any boundaries. And so users are just finding, this interaction quite awkward, quite uncomfortable, because there's no well-defined rules of etiquette that they have to follow. So along with that, some key problem areas for Airbnb are the glitches in the functionality and calendar of Airbnb's online platform, a lack of 24/7 human support, and so more transparency is needed in terms of what Airbnb's role is in the whole system, because users are quite confused by that and don't quite know what it is. Health and safety is still not a priority for Airbnb, and by that I mean there's no health and safety training for hosts. Users aren't really reassured that the hosts and the listings are real and they're authentic. And there are no spot checks or any sort of health and safety inspections that are taking place to assess whether hosts are adhering to these regulations, as we would see in hotels. Some guests, they also mentioned that perhaps if the messaging app on Airbnb, if it functions similarly to Facebook Messenger or WhatsApp, perhaps hosts and guests could also have this very direct means of communication, and they wouldn't have to log into their email accounts every time they have a update from Airbnb. And lastly, more clarity is needed in terms of policy regarding insurance, regarding terms and conditions, regarding the risks that are in the system. So this study, to the best of my knowledge, is actually the that has been done qualitatively or quantitatively to address this major gap and to really stress the importance of introducing user health and safety into current discussions on Airbnb's policies and best practices. There is very little that has been done on platform work as an experience, and even less with findings grounded in conversations with people who do this type of work. And so this multi-method design really did allow for triangulation and more sources of rich data. However, since this was a master's project and it came with a time and resource constraints, it did very much limit the scope of the project. And so interviews were done mostly in, they're mostly done in Toronto and Waterloo, but participants were sampled only across Ontario. So it would have been nice to see it done across Canada and probably make comparisons between provinces and cities. Also, in terms of type of participants, it would have been nice to do interviews with the key informants, maybe policymakers. And I was only able to really approach the research question through online document analysis and interviews, but perhaps a method like ethnography could have really given me some really nice insight into how things are happening at the Airbnb for the host. So just to conclude, these findings have definitely shed light on the situation of users in the system and have very much shed light on the needs for these users that are not being addressed at the current state. It is very important for us to learn how workers, in terms of the host, important for us to learn how workers understand the system and how they're able to react to the pressures. And it's really important for us to keep in mind who these hosts are, how old are they male, are they female, where do they come from? Is platform work what they do full-time or is it on the side? And so as a researcher, it can be easy for us to disconnect ourselves from them, but I feel like it's very important for us to really understand the context of this type of work and to really capture their stories and their meanings. Especially since the access economy is only going to grow. And so it's very important for us to really consider the implications of Airbnb's health and safety on both guests and host. And these health and safety considerations have very important implications for housing, for hotels, for short-term rentals. And so I think it's time for us to really rethink the role of Airbnb and for us to really rethink just how laissez-faire we want to allow Airbnb to be in terms of health and safety, and to really discuss health and safety more. Especially because, as we all know, work is changing quite a bit, and the access economy is changing work quite a bit. And so we really have to make sure that we're doing whatever we can as a system to really function and support workers well. So thank you very much. I'd love to hear any questions or any feedback.
Thank you, Julia. I was really looking forward to this presentation. I think the most we, the information we usually get is from media, and only then when it's negative. So I was really looking forward to getting evidence, hearing the evidence in this area, and especially as it relates to health and safety. So thank you so much for taking time to present this research today. I see one question coming in now, so let me get to that. But we do have 20 minutes, so please feel free to ask your questions. Now is your opportunity. So a comment and maybe a question. A comment. I'll start off with a comment. Beautiful presentation, Julia, from Margaret. I've been a guest at a bed and breakfast for many decades. In the last 2 years, I've used Airbnb because of all its features that aren't available with regular B&Bs. These older B&Bs belong to regional and national associations that advertise them. I wonder whether there are any health and safety controls or inspections for these other B&Bs. So I wonder, Julia, if you can maybe expand on the difference between B&Bs and Airbnbs as it relates to health and safety.
Sure, of course. So thank you so much for your question, Margaret, and I'm so happy that you were able to attend. Margaret and I actually have worked on a few things together, so that's really nice to see that you're here today. In terms of Airbnb versus hotels versus, I guess, the very traditional bread and breakfast, so what sometimes people, I guess, don't realize too is that hotels, obviously, they have all these policies in place that they're following, and that's great. In terms of regular B&Bs, they actually also are following policies and safety controls and all that sorts of stuff as well. The only reason that Airbnb is sort of not doing that is because it's situated as a third party. Hey, it's just a room in your house, what's the big deal? And so they've been very clever. I actually admire their business model quite a bit because they've managed to situate themselves in such a way that they don't really identify with B&Bs or with hotels in that same way. And so they're being excluded right now in terms of, I guess, the policies that are in place. If that answers your question at all, maybe I.
Okay, Margaret, if that doesn't answer your question or doesn't answer it fully, and you want to have Julia expand on that, please let us know. While we're waiting for other questions to come in, Julia, I wondered I might just take you through a couple of questions on my own. You said the stress is unknown, and that really resonated with me because it must be very difficult as a host when you're depending on this, to pay your bills and to provide for you financially to really, deal with that kind of stress. Was that something that came out in the literature?
In terms of Airbnb or other types of work?
In terms of Airbnb, but if as it relates to other sort of short-term rentals as well.
So in terms of Airbnb, not much has been done in terms of workers, but there was one article, I forget the authors now, but it was basically on the anxiety that hosts feel sort of under this algorithm sort of system that they're basically everything that they're doing is being monitored and they're being rated and everything as such, and basically how that's creating a lot of stress for them because they're trying to navigate the system of algorithms. In terms of work experience and stress, a lot more has been done for other platform works. And due to my experiences with the Uber study, that study actually focused quite a bit on health and safety and stress of that type of work. But I think it's really neat because this project was really the first one to really look at it from this perspective. Most of the discussion right now is very much on the impact on hotels, the impact on the economy, the impact on tourism. There hasn't really been much done in terms of health and safety and stress.
Right. Okay. And you mentioned that there was the host mentioned that they didn't experience any physical harm. Yes. And that kind of surprised me because there were indicators that could happen. For example, with the sexual harassment, that one guest was involved. One guest sort of was involved in with the host, and I guess one could argue that might be a sort of physical harm. And so I wondered, again, were you surprised by that finding?
So I was quite surprised because before I did this project, I obviously had my own sort of preconceptions that I had about things, and I just assumed that would be the greatest concern because they're just strangers and you're worried about getting hurt. But at the same time too, what I also realized during interviews and really comparing what I found in forums and comparing what I found in person was a lot of impression management in person. And so even in terms of sexual harassment, in person, female hosts, they would share their experiences, but they wouldn't really make it appear as it's really affecting them because they want to appear like they're stoic and they're strong and they're like we're great hosts, like we're this whole experience is great. But then when you go online and they're behind a screen and it's anonymous, it's quite interesting how much they open up. Obviously, it's not the same individuals, and I don't mean to say that, but I find it quite interesting how, based on the medium, hosts describe the experience quite differently. And also, I think too, hosts, both hosts and guests, they had a really hard time even identifying things as risks. And so when I came down to health and safety and stuff like physical harm and violence and all sorts of things, they were really thinking it through for the first time with me. And that was really apparent. And so I think maybe perhaps the language that they use perhaps for experiences were different than what we would use as researchers or as people who are trying to sort of classify experiences in one bucket or the next. But yeah, I was surprised. I thought physical harm would be one of the key concerns.
Right.
For anyone in the system, for sure.
Right. Okay, thank you. So Margaret has a comment. Thanks, Julia. It'll be a neat study to compare the two kinds of B&Bs. Your findings resonated with me as a frequent Airbnb guest. On the negative side, I stayed at one place where the smoke battery, was dead. So it didn't prevent a kitchen pot that burnt to the point of filling the space with smoke. The owner thanked me for alerting him and said he would replace it right away. But that hadn't been on his safety radar.
Right.
So that's a really good point in terms of, monitoring or who's accountable for monitoring health and safety. On the positive side, Margaret continues, I use the review features of Airbnb to assess the likelihood of having a good relationship with the host. I judge the host's reaction to critical reviews, how they interact with me by email and phone. When I find a host with whom I have a good relationship, I become a return guest. I also try to be a good guest, so I get good reviews as a host. So I get good reviews as a guest, sorry. Yeah. So that helps me cement relationships with hosts. Thank you, Margaret. Those are really good tips.
Yeah.
So while we're waiting for any more questions to come in, I wanted to just ask if one thing that concerns me as somebody who works with people with disabilities and as a person with a disability, I'm always looking out for accessibility issues. And I have used Airbnb before and actually had a very good experience. But, I think that might be just the luck of the draw. And I wonder if accessibility issues are built into policy in any way.
So Airbnb, in terms of their policy, so that's pretty much why they introduced instant booking, because they had wanted it to be sort of that there's no discrimination, and they had basically wanted a space that was accessible and was open for everyone and very inclusive. That was sort of their mindset for it. So in terms of assistive animals, in terms of wheelchair accessibility, Airbnb prefers hosts to provide those accommodations and those spaces and everything else for guests. But what's happening is, I think, and hosts won't say this because I'm trying to figure out how to phrase this. Hosts had a tendency to basically make it appear as if it was unsafe and unhealthy to accommodate certain guests. But once I took it like one step further and I really read what they were saying, it was just that some hosts just found it very inconvenient. It wasn't a matter of health or safety for them, but they just didn't want to be, so to speak, in the hassle of trying to accommodate these guests. Airbnb can't force, obviously, a host to host whoever, but at the same time, if a host does cancel a booking, let's say if the Airbnb was booked using instant booking And if a host did cancel the booking, and the Airbnb does penalize the host for doing that. In this interaction, only the guest is able to cancel the booking.
Okay, so if a host cancels the booking, then they're penalized for that.
Yes, they are.
Okay.
And then there's this huge process where they have to go back to Airbnb and explain the situation, and their case managers, and this whole process of trying to, I guess, reverse the penalization.
Right.
But obviously hosts are always weary because they don't want to go through that process should something happen. So oftentimes, even if they don't want to, they'll just accommodate to avoid that process from happening.
Okay, so in some respects, then that could open the door to abuses in that if the Airbnb host is afraid or doesn't want to go through the hassle, they might put up with unsafe situations that they wouldn't necessarily. Is that
exactly?
Is that accurate?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
And I mean, it goes both ways too. I mean, if a guest is staying in a place where the host is very visibly not welcoming and, isn't really treating them well, I mean, it goes both ways when it's a forced booking in that sense.
Okay.
I mean, that's why, from my perspective, I feel like it's so important that we do have some policies in place to help us, because right now there's no system. And people are just doing things on a whim.
Right. So another comment. So relationship building is part of maintaining psychological safety and maybe physical safety for both hosts and guests. This process is facilitated by the Airbnb features in a way that older B&Bs don't facilitate. So, that's a point that maybe Airbnbs are, have a management system that's in place that maybe the Airbnbs don't. Another comment is, I can imagine that hosts under pressure to cover their rent costs or mortgage costs will take guests they consider sketchy and thus put themselves at risk. This may be an issue of the wider problem of the lack of affordable housing for hosts. That's actually a very good point. I wonder if you want to comment on that.
So yeah, oftentimes, I mean, it's funny because some hosts, I mean, they even, when describing sort of how they're taking care of the guests, some hosts will say, you know what, like, I'm doing everything I can do. I'll have breakfast at the table. I'll make sure they're very comfortable. And that was the majority of hosts. But one or two hosts basically said, you know what, like, if I don't have to do something, I won't do it. And so some hosts, they have the mentality that they want to do the bare minimum that they have to do just to keep the guests happy, or just as what they advertise on the listing, and they're very careful about what they put on the listing, so that they only have to do the bare minimum in terms of their requirements. But I think that's a huge issue with Airbnb, because housing is obviously getting very pricey, especially in cities like Toronto and Vancouver. And so there's also this worry that obviously with Airbnb looking like a much more viable option for hosts and for people to supplement some income with, it does very much displace places that were traditionally long-term housing options to become more short-term. And so it definitely does change the architecture of the city, but also in terms of housing options for I guess locals.
Right. So we don't have much time left. We have 3 minutes. So I wanted to sort of leave by having you answer this one question, and that is, this is clearly an emerging body of literature that you have identified, and that is, health and safety in Airbnbs. As the gig economy grows, I think creating frameworks around these type of industries is very important. Having said that, I'm wondering what you hope, what type of action or is taken up by your research?
So I personally, I think in terms of, I mean, something that I'm still thinking about is whether in terms of policy and in terms of enforcement, because enforcement is obviously always so hard to do, whether that should come from Airbnb or whether that should come from the government. That's one thing that I'm still thinking quite a bit about. But I don't think, I mean, we're seeing this now with Uber and taxis. I think there should be a much greater push on Airbnb and for it to act more like hotels do.
Mm-hmm.
And to perhaps treat it like a hotel, and perhaps have time to time sort of spot checks. Don't tell hosts when they're going to happen, but time to time have spot checks and to make sure that, you know, things are the way they should be.
Right.
And if not, then have fines attached to that.
Okay.
Some controls, because right now how things are going, I mean, I don't want my research to suggest that Airbnb is a terrible thing, because it's not. Most experiences have been quite wonderful, and that's fantastic for me to hear. But I also don't want us to think that it's good the way it is. I think there's lots of room for improvement, and I think we really have to consider how we do it going forward.
Right.
Have a much stricter approach to health and safety, primarily.
Well, thank you for answering that. I'm wondering, is there, just as an add-on to that, is there anything on the horizon that would suggest that that type of accountability framework is being worked on, or will something like that be implemented in the near future?
So in terms of health and safety, no. Right now, the cities are more concerned about, they're concerned about basically hosts that have multiple dwellings, and they're basically using the second, third, fourth home primarily for Airbnb. And so they're trying to avoid that in order to address housing issues and availability and affordability. And so that's sort of their focus right now. In terms of duration of hosting, how many days in a year you're able to use that space as an Airbnb, for how long, that sort of thing, sort of right now what cities are talking about, like Toronto. Nothing about health and safety. And so I hope that perhaps this would be the first step into that direction and that discussion about how we can also think about health and safety.